Just before we get into today's video, just wanted to say a quick thank you to the historic city of Quincy, Massachusetts for teaming up with us yet again and sponsoring another of our The Story of America video series, covering so far everything from Amelia Earhart and the dawn of U.S. commercial aviation to the forgotten other guy who co-invented the telephone and helped make the U.S. a naval powerhouse, to the true story of the Amistad, to that time Ben Franklin and John Adams slept together and the hilarity that ensued, covering how those two men teamed up on multiple occasions to help create the United States, utilizing their own, rather diametrically and sometimes humorously opposed methods. As for Quincy, which yes, is pronounced Quincy, not Quincy, the city is home to the Adams National Historic Park, which preserves the home of Presidents John Adams and John Quincy Adams. In Quincy, you can explore the birthplaces of these iconic individuals and walk the same halls as they once did, immersing yourself in the beginnings of the United States. But Quincy isn't all about the past, it's a city that beautifully blends history with present-day adventures and experiences. From the iconic USS Salem to the stunning views of the Blue Hills and the architectural elegance of Old City Hall and the Thomas Crane Library, there's something here for everyone. And let's not forget the Epicurean delight that is Quincy's food scene, with an array of global and local flavors. It's a culinary journey that you can't miss. To discover more about what Quincy has in store for you, check out discoverquincy.com. It's time to step into history and create some unforgettable memories. Now let's get into today's video. What are the qualifications of a Secretary of State? He ought to be a man of universal reading in laws, governments, history. Our whole terrestrial universe ought to be summarily comprehended in his mind. The speed at which the United States rose from birth to prominence on the world stage has rarely been matched in history. From first casting off a king and parliament that no longer served them, to unequivocally telling the rest of the world that the new nation would no longer allow any state from the old world to continue directly interfering with budding nations on the American side of the pond, took only 47 years. In all this, some of the most significant advancements in modern international politics and the United States' role in it came in part thanks to one man and the 8 years he spent as the U.S. Secretary of State. Trained from birth to serve his nation, you would be hard-pressed to find any individual in U.S. history more well-prepared for the role he was eventually chosen for. And the results? Well, they showed. This future president of the United States and, as noted by one-time governor of Virginia, Henry Wise, the acutest, the astutest, the archest enemy of Southern slavery that ever existed, is still today generally considered the greatest Secretary of State in United States history. For instance, in one poll conducted by Dr. David L. Porter of William Penn College, asking 50 of the leading diplomatic historians in the United States who they felt the best Secretary of States were, a whopping 80% of them chose as number one our man of the hour, John Quincy Adams, with a distant second place going to William H. Seward, Secretary of State under Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson. So without further ado, here now is the remarkable story of John Quincy Adams' rise to one of the most powerful offices in the nation, and how he irrevocably changed world history in countless ways, leveraging all the training his life and parents had provided him to do it. While it's a bit of a cliche for parents to make remarks like, "When my child grows up to become president," John Quincy Adams' world-changing parents seem to have taken this general concept very seriously, to the extent that anything less would have been a disappointment for their firstborn son, who came into this world on July 11, 1767. As the senior Adams would write in a letter to John Quincy on April 23, 1794, "You come into life with advantages which will disgrace you if your success is mediocre. And if you do not rise to the head not only of your profession, but of your country, it will be owing to your own laziness, slovenliness, and obstinacy. For the Adams family, service and self-sacrifice for the good of their community, and ultimately nation, were the name of the game and the very explicit purpose of life." As Abigail Adams would write to one John Thaxter in September of 1778, "It is true, says one, that mankind in general are a worthless and ungrateful set of beings for a man to wear out himself in serving. But if we do not lay out ourselves in the service of mankind, whom should we serve? Our own insignificant selves? That would be sordid indeed." of her husband's own service to his country that robbed them of each other's company for a large percentage of their first couple decades of marriage, Abigail was just as resolute, writing to John in October of 1774 of her support of him in his work for his nation, despite what it cost them personally, financially, and even with regards to their own safety, stating, "I dare not express to you at 300 miles distance how ardently I long for your return, but you cannot, I know, nor do I wish to see you an inactive spectator. We have too many high-sounding words and too few actions to correspond with them. As for me, I will work willingly with my hands for all our industry and economy." And work she did with her skills and success with investment and trade now rather legendary. In all, generally managing their home and financial affairs so that her husband could in turn attend to helping create the new nation, while she made sure he had any money he needed while gallivanting around the world, as well as, in the end, still had a home to come home to when he was done. Her efforts and investment savvy are largely why, unlike most of the early US presidents who started off extremely wealthy but ended their lives deeply in debt, John and Abigail Adams started off approximately middle class and ended their lives relatively wealthy despite the often rather lackluster government salaries and extreme expenses associated with the positions John Adams held over the years. This all brings us to the fall of 1778. At this point, things were not looking good for the traitors to king and country in the British American colonies. In the early going, the American Revolutionary forces under George Washington had suffered defeat after resounding defeat, including Washington very nearly losing around half his army in the first major battle of the war, only saved by a providential fog and General William Howe deciding inexplicably not to press the attack when Washington's forces were surrounded before this. Howe made a similar, just as inexplicable blunder in November and December of 1776. After yet another near catastrophic defeat of the rebels when nearly 3,000 American troops were captured at Fort Washington, General Washington limped the remaining 4,000 or so members of his army south to Delaware. Howe and his vastly larger, better equipped, and better trained forces were nearby and could have crushed the Continental Army and either captured or killed Washington. But once again, for what reasons are not fully clear today, Howe chose not to pursue his enemy, hanging on by a hope and a prayer, and instead began the process of setting up a winter camp with no further offensives planned until spring. Needless to say, something needed to change or the rebellion was doomed and Washington and his cohorts would soon find themselves enjoying a short drop and a sudden stop. And so it was that Congress turned their sights on Britain's longtime on and off again enemy in France for help. At the time, it was exceedingly dangerous to transport diplomats from the United States to France, given the British more or less completely controlled the sea in between. But Congress nonetheless had previously managed to successfully send Silas Deane, and not long after, in December of 1776, Ben Franklin and Arthur Lee to see about getting desperately needed aid from France. However, while the trio were in France working toward this, Lee accused Deane of financial impropriety, and Deane was recalled to answer the charges. To try to help, Franklin gave Deane a letter of commendation disputing the charges against him. Franklin also would later lament Lee's seeming delusions and paranoia on a number of such matters, not just with regards to Deane, writing to Lee on April 3rd, 1778, "My love of peace, my respect for your good qualities, and my pity of your sick mind, which is forever tormenting itself with its jealousies, suspicions, and fancies that others mean you ill, wrong you, or fail in respect for you. If you do not cure yourself of this temper, it will end in insanity, of which it is the symptomatic forerunner, as I have seen in several instances. God preserve you from so terrible an evil, and for his sake, pray suffer me to live in quiet." Lee's alleged sick mind, however, had done irreparable damage to Deane. Once a prominent patriot and wealthy merchant, Deane lost everything, forced to rely on the charity of his remaining friends to get by, and not long after he would die in disgrace and exile, considered a traitor by his country despite no real evidence against him outside of Lee's accusations. And indeed, to sum up his tale briefly, after Deane's death, at the request of Deane's granddaughter, Congress completed an audit of Deane's financial records, as well as looked over records concerning the whole affair and determined Deane had been falsely accused and had, in fact, acted honorably in his service to the United States while in France. For the injustice, as well as in partial compensations for supply ships Dean had arranged from France to the United States during the war, but had never been reimbursed for after the scandal, Congress awarded Dean's heirs $37,000, which is about $1.1 million today. But rewinding back to Dean's recall in Washington and the Revolution's dire predicament, Congress decided to send the tenacious John Adams to replace Dean and assist Franklin and Lee. Adams' specific mission: negotiate a treaty with France to hopefully get desperately needed supplies and money to the rebellion, as well as direct naval and army aid against the British. There was an issue, however. It turns out there exists a giant ocean in between the United States and France, and, as alluded to, that ocean at the time was heavily populated by British ships with captains who would like nothing better than to arrest and hang for treason one of the principal architects of the Revolution in John Adams. And if the humans Adams might meet along the way weren't problematic enough, there was also the fact that it was the dead of winter, time of year in which the ocean enjoys even more than normal, taking any humans that dare try to exist on its surface and depositing them in its murky depths, where all but their bones would almost immediately become the excrement of sea life. That's not to mention, at this time in history, even if you could manage to keep the bundle of dead trees and ironmongery you were floating on above the waterline, transatlantic crossings were also dangerous from simple things like rampant diseases aboard. Needless to say, the Adamses had some considering to do on whether John would accept the nomination. Unfortunately, the couple's discussion over the matter has been lost to history owing to taking place in person, unlike literally thousands of their conversations via letter during this period, thanks to the couple being separated on and off again for the better part of about 15 years, including the aforementioned approximately 5-year straight stretch, which Abigail Adams would refer to as her widowhood and patriotic duty. But whatever their specific words, the outcome was inevitable. As happened again and again and again, John and Abigail Adams both felt strongly, and made sure to drill the same into their children, that if the nation called, it was their duty to answer no matter what it cost them personally. With once again Abigail handling the home front, freeing up John to focus on whatever task his country had given him. That said, in this case, initially Abigail had argued the entire family should go with him, but John writes that this proposal she was soon convinced was too hazardous and imprudent. They did, however, decide to send their 10-year-old son John Quincy as well. Abigail would write she had 1,000 fears about this, including the temptations Paris offered a young man, should their stay ultimately span years, the possibility the ship would end up at the bottom of the ocean or captured, and John Quincy impressed into the British Navy, etc. But despite all these risks, they felt that if he survived and remained uncaptured, it would all likely be a phenomenal life experience for him to help prepare him for the life of greatness and service they expected of him. Beyond this, it would also afford him time directly under the care of his father as he began the transition from boy to man. And so it was that at the age of 10, John Quincy Adams would complete an extremely risky and rather harrowing trip across the Big Blue, including being chased by a few British warships right at the start. But it was totally fine, because while they were being chased by the ships bent on their destruction, a massive storm came up. Naturally, all involved suddenly had much more pressing things to think about. As the senior Adams wrote in his journal, "We lost sight of our enemy, but the wind increased to a hurricane." In the midst of being tossed about by waves bigger than the ship, the vessel was struck by lightning, killing one man and injuring several others. Adams recounts of the aftermath of the strike. "I heard a cry that the powder room was open. Cartridges, powder horns, if not some small casks of powder, had been left rather carelessly in various parts of the ship, near the guns. If a spark of lightning had touched any of those, the consequences might have been disagreeable enough. But if it had reached the powder room, it would have made an end to the business." After being tossed about in the storm, the crew patched up the ship and not long after had a good old-fashioned sea battle with a British merchant vessel. In this one, John Adams was ordered below by the captain, whose charge it was to see him safely delivered to France, no matter what. However, after a volley of cannon fire just over the heads of the sailors, the captain recounted he spotted Adams to, quote, "among my marines accounted as one of them, and in the act of defense. I then went unto him and said, 'My dear sir, how came you here?' And with a smile he replied, 'I ought to do my share of fighting.' This was sufficient for me to judge of the bravery of my venerable and patriotic Adams." After that, they endured another massive storm and an exploding cannon which mortally wounded one sailor. Later, 2 more British warships inexplicably silently very closely passed them by in the middle of the night without harrying them. The list goes on and on. See our upcoming video on our sister channel, Traveling Through History, A Perilous Journey, John Adams Goes to France, for much more. But for now, the 10-year-old John Quincy endured that trip with distinction, with John Adams writing about his son's conduct in their possibly hurricane storm at sea. The child's behavior gave me a satisfaction that I cannot express. Fully sensible of our danger, he was constantly endeavoring to bear up under it with a manly courage and patience. Very attentive to me, and his thoughts always running in a serious strain. Going back to Abigail and her and John Adams' expectation of their children, after the trip, she took the opportunity to let the junior John know, "For dear as you are to me, I had much rather you should have found your grave in the ocean you have crossed, or any untimely death crop you in your infant years, rather than see you an immoral, profligate, or graceless child." She would otherwise also write to him about a decade later while he was attending Harvard, "How unpardonable would it have been in you to have become a blockhead." Speaking of his intelligence, rewinding back to her son's time in Europe, she would write to him on January the 19th, 1780, slightly more softly, though still being crystal clear about her expectations. "It will be expected of you, my son, that as you are favored with superior advantages under the instructive eye of a tender parent, that your improvements should bear some proportion to your advantages. Nothing is wanting with you but attention, diligence, and steady application. Nature has not been deficient." And that he should relish in the struggle because these are the times in which a genius would wish to live. It is not in the still calm of life or the repose of Pacific Station that great characters are formed. Would Cicero have shown so distinguished an orator if he had not been roused, kindled, and inflamed by the tyranny of Catiline, Milio, Verus, and Mark Antony? The habits of a vigorous mind are formed in contending with difficulties. All history will convince you of this, and that wisdom and penetration are the fruits of experience, not the lessons of retirement and leisure. She then, naturally, concludes the letter discussing his faults and her desire he work diligently to overcome them, writing, "I cannot fulfill the whole of my duty towards you if I close this letter without reminding you of a failing which calls for a strict attention and watchful care to correct. You must do it for yourself. You must curb that impetuosity of temper for which I frequently chide you, but which properly directed may be productive of a great good. If you indulge yourself in the practice of any foible or vice in youth, it will gain strength with your years and become your conqueror. The strict and inviolable regard you have ever paid to truth gives me pleasing hopes that you will not swerve from her dictates, but add justice, fortitude, and every manly virtue which can adorn a good citizen, do honor to your country, and render your parents supremely happy, particularly of your ever affectionate mother." Lucky for him, and her, as she noted, nature was not deficient in his case, with her son in his time, and still today, considered to have been a genius of special distinction. So just how smart was he? According to a 2006 study, Presidential IQ, Openness, Intellectual Brilliance, and Leadership, Estimates and Correlations for 42 U.S. Chief Executives, done by Professor Dean Simonton of UC Davis, after extensive evaluation of all U.S. presidents up through 2006, when the study was published, Simonton determined Adams had an IQ of about 168, which not only put him thoroughly in the genius category, but a genius of geniuses. But going back to his father, while as mentioned, there were periods John Adams wasn't always exactly present throughout the Revolution, even during some of their time in Europe, when parted, the senior Adams still wrote to his son regularly, asking him to read and even translate certain works he felt important to study, from Virgil, Horace, Aristotle, and Plutarch to Thucydides and Hugo Grotius, because, to quote, "In company with Sallust, Cicero, Tacitus, and Livy, you will learn wisdom and virtue. You will see them represented with all the charms which language and imagination can exhibit, and vice and folly painted in all their deformity and horror. And that most importantly in all of this, you will ever remember that all the end of study is to make you a good man and a useful citizen." A message drilled into the young man over and over and over again by both parents. Become a good man and a useful citizen and, of course, excel at everything you do, even in leisure activities. As the senior Adams would write on December the 28th, 1780, "As your constitution requires vigorous exercise, it will not be amiss to spend some of your time in swimming, riding, dancing, fencing, and skating, which are all manly amusements, and it is as easy to learn by a little attention to perform them all with taste, as it is to execute them in slovenly, awkward, and ridiculous manner." And on this point, everything in life should be done with reflection and judgment, even the most insignificant amusements. They should all be arranged in subordination to the great plan of happiness and utility. That you may attend early to this maxim is the wish of your affectionate father. As for more formal schooling that Junior Adams received during his teen years, this was decidedly disjointed owing to flitting around Europe, but these included a private academy outside of Paris, a Latin school in Amsterdam, and not long after that attending Leiden University in 1781, registering at the tender age of just 13. As to the choice to send John Quincy and another of his sons away to Leiden, John wrote to Abigail he sent them because it is much cheaper there than here, the air is infinitely purer, and the company and conversation are better. It is perhaps as learned a university as any in Europe. To his son, he wrote, "You have now a prize in your hands indeed, such as if you do not improve to the best advantage, you will be without excuse. But as I know you have an ardent thirst for knowledge and a good capacity to acquire it, I depend upon it, you will do no dishonor to yourself nor to the University of Leiden." He also asked his son to write back to him reports of lectures he attended, as well as to study the university itself and how it functioned and his analysis of it. As for Abigail, she would chime in hoping John Quincy's time at Leiden would be used not only for learning within the walls of the university, but also without, asking him to study the people of the nation and their history for the lessons to be learned from them. She also threw in, "I hope, my dear boy, that the universal neatness and cleanliness of the people where you reside will cure you of all your slovenly tricks, and that you will learn from them industry, economy, and frugality. Once again, be perfect, live to serve, excel at everything, and write to tell me all about it. Got it, Mom and Dad." Yet excel he did. In fact, his time at Leiden was cut short because of a portion of his talents. At the age of just 14, John Quincy was selected as secretary and translator to famed American diplomat Francis Dana, who, among other things, was a one-time member of the Continental Congress, signer of the Articles of Confederation, secretary to the U.S. delegation negotiating the Treaty of Paris, eventual Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Court, strong advocate for the ratification of the Constitution once it was proposed to the state of Massachusetts, and at one point, a man who came dangerously close to rocking a mullet. But before the latter items on that list, he was appointed to become the Minister of Russia and thusly dispatched. His mission was summed up by then President of the Continental Congress, Samuel Huntington. "The great object of your negotiation is to engage Her Imperial Majesty, Catherine the Great, to favor and support the sovereignty and independence of these United States, and to lay a foundation for good understanding and friendly intercourse between the subjects of Her Imperial Majesty and the citizens of these states, to the mutual advantage of both nations." While there, he was in need of a trusted secretary who was fluent in French, the chief language at the court in Russia at the time, and could help translate things for him. Thus, he turned to the child prodigy in John Quincy, who seemed to soak up new languages like a sponge. Not that sponges learn languages easily, you understand. Or at all, really. It's very difficult to speak when one lacks a brain, despite what many prominent individuals in the world today seem to demonstrate. The point, you see, was not to comment on the viability of a sponge soaking up a language, but that John Quincy Adams's brain was like a sponge with water, but with languages.
Metaphor.
Sorta. John Adams would write in his journal, his son, "Learn more French in a day than I could learn in a week with all my books." And note, contrary to popular belief, adults, not kids, usually learn languages markedly faster hour for hour of study, for obvious reasons if you really stop to think about it. But for full details as to why and where the myth that kids learn languages faster came from, despite quite literally all evidence to the contrary, see our video, "Do Kids Really Learn Languages Faster Than Adults?" But going back to John Quincy, while he'd later lament the interruption to his formal schooling because of Dana's need here, nevertheless his country called, so he answered. And so it was that the 14-year-old boy officially got to work for his nation for the first time, beginning with an over 1,000-mile trip across Europe. Dana describes the journey in a letter to John Adams on September the 8th, 1781. "From Leipzig, I began to travel day and night and continued this practice all along the remaining distance. At Berlin, we rested, or were rather stopped, 9 days by the unfortunate accident of our voitures being overthrown and broken into pieces. The first time I had attempted to travel at night. I there bought a new one. This, however, failed in essential parts and required many repairs along the way. Notwithstanding the above accident, I resolved to risk all again and persist in traveling in the night. On the whole, from Amsterdam to this city, we were 51 days. After all, you will not be surprised to learn I am told, in effect, that I am here too soon, that the proper time is not yet come. He would go on in the letter concerning John Quincy's education, "Your son is desirous of my procuring him a private instructor. I shall endeavor to do the best with him. Your sentiments on this point may not be amiss." And added in a letter dated January 25th, 1782, "Your son is in high health, he pursues his Latin, has translated Cornelius Nepos de Viribus Illustribus throughout, and is just beginning upon Cicero's Orations. Do you think 'tis time for him to read history, and which should you prefer? I have subscribed to the British Library here, where there is a good collection of English authors. Would it not be advisable that he should compose in French, and to that end that he should write you in French? You will please give me such directions as you think best for the pursuit of his studies." While in Russia, the teen also, at the behest of his parents, studied the governing system, ultimately writing a lengthy formal essay on his analysis, and then summing up his paper in a letter to his mother in September of 1783. "As you have ordered me in a letter which I have lately received to give you my own observations on the countries through which I have traveled, the following are some upon Russia. The sovereign is absolute in all the extent of the word. The persons, the estates, the fortunes of the nobility depend entirely upon his caprice, and the nobility have the same power over the people that the sovereign has over them. The nation is wholly composed of nobles and serfs, or in other words, of masters and slaves." He then very astutely observed, "This form of government is disadvantageous to the sovereign, to the nobles, and to the people. For first, it exposes the sovereign every moment to revolutions of which there have been already 4 in the course of this century. Secondly, as the nobles all depend wholly upon the sovereign, they are always in danger of their estates being confiscated and themselves sent into Siberia. This is certainly not advantageous for the nobility. And thirdly, as to the people, nobody, I believe, will assert that a people can be happy who are subjected to personal slavery. Some of these serfs are immensely rich, but they are not free, and therefore they are despised. Besides, they depend still upon the nobles, who make them contribute the more for their riches." Ultimately, after about a year and a half in Russia, the young Adams traveled solo from Russia to the Netherlands, taking a rather roundabout route to have a good time in certain countries, before eventually reuniting with his dear old dad. It was during this time, living in The Hague, at around 16, he would write, "It was this precise time of my change from boy to man." It was also during this time in The Hague, rather humorously, while the stereotypical teen today will have posters of their favorite musicians, sports athletes, or the like, John Quincy had a replica of a portrait of George Washington hung upon his bedroom wall, generally thought to have been copied from the 1780 portrait of Washington done by John Trumbull. If you guess John Quincy idolized General Washington as a young man, you'd be correct. And as we'll get to in a future video in this series, that idolization would eventually indirectly help vault the young Adams from laboring in obscurity to world prominence. But going back to his late teens, rounding out this particular time in Europe, beyond hobnobbing with the likes of Thomas Jefferson, who for a time was almost a second father to him, John Quincy also served as his father's secretary during the development of the Treaty of Paris, which ended the Revolutionary War with incredibly favorable terms to the new nation, and provided the junior Adams with yet more real-world experience observing the highest levels of government and their interactions. From here, while the elder Adams did briefly consider enrolling his son at Oxford to keep him closer at hand, religious issues with the institution ultimately settled him on sending him back to the United States to attend Harvard, as he himself had done. However, given John Quincy's rather disjointed formal education, more preparation was first needed, and the senior Adams decided to take matters into his own hands this time. As he wrote, "In the course of the last year, instead of playing cards like the fashionable world, I have spent my evenings with him. We went with some accuracy through the geometry in the Preceptor, the 8 books of Simpson's Euclid in Latin, and compared it, problem by problem and theorem by theorem, with Lee Pierre de Chalais in French. We went through plane trigonometry and plane sailing, Fenning's algebra, and the decimal fractions, arithmetical and geometrical proportions, and the conic sections in Ward's mathematics." This description goes on and on and on in this way, but suffice it to say, they did a lot of math, translated and studied various important works, and otherwise attempted to cram every bit of knowledge they could into John Quincy's head. Abigail would write, observing these nightly educational affairs, "The table is covered with mathematical instruments, and you hear nothing till 9 o'clock but of theorem and problems bisecting and dissecting tangents and sequence. In the end, writing to Dr. Benjamin Waterhouse at Harvard of this preparation and where his son was at academically, Adams states, among other things, "If you were to examine him in the English and French poetry, I know not where you would find anybody as superior. In Roman and English history, few persons of his age. It is rare to find a youth possessed of such knowledge. He has translated Virgil's Aeneid, Suetonius, the whole of Sallust, Tacitus, Agricola, his Germany, and several other books of his annals, a great part of Horace, some of Ovid, and some of Caesar's commentaries and writing, besides a number of Tully's orations. In Greek, his progress has not been equal, yet he has studied morsels in Aristotle's Poetics, in Plutarch's Lives, and Lucian's Dialogues, the Choice of Hercules, in Xenophon, and lately he has gone through several books of Homer's Iliad." And so it was that after spending most of his time from 10 to 17 years old roaming around Europe, rubbing elbows with some of the most distinguished individuals of the era, and becoming fluent in a handful of languages, as well as the beneficiary of nightly study by the side of his extremely well-educated father, John Quincy Adams and a pack of hunting dogs boarded a ship and headed to America to attend Harvard in 1785. Well, John Quincy was going to attend Harvard. Sadly, the dogs, despite each one being such a good boy, were, it would seem, based on admission records, denied entry to that university. We can only presume owing to its admission board being then, as now, notoriously doggist. Instead, the dogs were delivered to George Washington as a gift from the Marquis de Lafayette, and ultimately spent their days not in academic pursuit of a doctorate, but in pursuit of animals Washington was hunting. Noteworthy, not only denying these dogs admission, somewhat surprisingly, at first Harvard also chose to forego admitting John Quincy, and instead recommended that he go brush up on a few things for a few months first under the tutelage of his uncle John Shaw. It was during this period that his aunt Mary Cranch would write to Abigail of her assessment of John Quincy after spending some time with her freshly returned nephew. "I have already discovered a strength of mind, a memory, a soundness of judgment of which I have seldom seen united in one so young. If his application is equal to his abilities, he cannot fail of making a great man." And later that he is admired everywhere he goes for his modest behavior. "I want to know what he thinks of us all. He enters into characters with a penetration that astonishes me. If I had anything in my disposition that I wished to hide, I would not be acquainted with him. He is formed for a statesman." His other aunt, Elizabeth Shaw, would likewise write Abigail of how impressed she and her husband were with the young man, though she also lamented he had imbibed some curious notions and was rather peculiar in some of his opinions, and a little too decisive and tenacious of them. Mr. Thomas said to him one day, "I think, brother, you seem to differ most always from everyone else in the company." And I used to tell him that I had seen people, while they thought they were possessed of and adopting the most liberal sentiments, grow contracted and illiberal, and that though I was willing to allow him every advantage, which I knew he was possessed of above his contemporaries, yet there was more than a probability that he would think differently at different periods of his life. Most young people of his age are apt to think they are certainly right. It is a fault which at the early period of 18, if I may be allowed to the expression, that generally arrives at its greatest perfection. But it is what good sense, time, and experience will naturally expel. In response to this, and working on keeping her son humble, Abigail would write to him, "The attention you have always given to your studies and the fondness you have for literature precludes any other injunctions to you than that of taking care of your health. I believe I ought to accept one other, which is a watchfulness over yourself that the knowledge you have acquired does not make you assuming and too tenacious of your own opinions." And with regards to his extensive knowledge of some of the world compared to some of his teachers, she writes, "And whatever your own sentiments may be with regard of the abilities and qualifications of your preceptors, you should always endeavor to treat them with the respect due to their station, and that, if you are conscious to yourself that you possess more knowledge upon some subjects than others, reflect that you have had greater opportunities of seeing the world and obtaining a knowledge of mankind than any of your contemporaries, that you have never wanted a book, but it has been supplied to you, that your whole time has been spent in the company of men of literature and science." Going back to his mother's former wish that his time at Leiden would cure her son of his slovenliness, by accounts from Elizabeth of the young Adams' time at Harvard, it did not. She writes, "I could not help laughing at John for the learned dirt, not to say rust, he had about and around him. I almost scolded. However, we seized his gown and jacket and had a clean one put on. I took my scissors and put his nails into a decent form and recommended strongly a comb and a hair string to him. He invited me to come once a quarter and perform the like good service for him again." Much to the chagrin of many who knew him, this was something he never figured out how to fix, later writing his eventual wife, Louisa, "The tailor and the dancing master must give me up as a man of whom nothing can be made." A sentiment she'd already long since noticed, remarking of one of her first meetings with the young man, "His dress did not impress us agreeably, as it made his person appear to a very great disadvantage." Even while president, he seemingly never improved in this area, right from the inauguration becoming the first US president to forego knee breeches and a powdered wig, instead wearing a simple, plain, homespun outfit and nothing on his head but his own natural hair. Samuel Griswold Goodrich's 1856 Recollections of a Lifetime would also quote an unknown author about what one could expect if invited to meet the President John Quincy Adams in the White House. He sees a little man writing at a table nearly bald with a face quite formal and destitute of expression, his eyes running with water, his slippers down at the heel, his fingers stained with ink. In summer wearing a striped seasucker coat and white trousers and a dirty waistcoat spotted with ink, his whole dress altogether not worth a couple of pounds, or in a colder season habited in a plain blue coat, much the worse for wear, and other garments in proportion. This person, whom the ambassador mistakes for a clerk in a department, and only wonders in looking at him that the president should permit a man to appear before him in such dress, proves to be the President of the United States himself. But going back to his time as a student at Harvard, John Quincy Adams ultimately found it humbling, writing it has been productive of good effects, particularly in reducing my opinion of myself. That said, he still finished second in his class and was required to give an oration at the graduation ceremony. He thus wrote an essay on the importance and necessity of public faith to the well-being of a community. Mirroring somewhat modern times, he wrote to his father about the choice of topic, "The subject is noble and of the greatest consequence, for our public faith at present is in a sad condition." This would be the first of many essays and speeches from the man who would become known as Old Man Eloquent to be published in the papers, including the Columbian Magazine, though not before a rather vehement back and forth with one Dr. Jeremy Belknap, with John Quincy at first requiring it to be published anonymously, but later relenting and leaving it up to Belknap. In his speech delivered on July 18, 1787, he begins, "On whatever side we turn our anxious eyes, the prospect of public affairs is dark and gloomy. The distressing scarcity of circulating medium has been continually increasing. The violent gust of a rebellion is scarcely dissipated, and threatening clouds of sullen discontent are still lowering around the horizon. The bonds of union which connected us with our sister states have been shamefully relaxed by a selfish and contracted principle, and the sails of commerce furled within our ports witness the lamentable declination of our trade. At this critical period, when the whole nation is groaning under the intolerable burden of these accumulated evils, and while the most tremendous calamities are suspended by a slender thread over our heads, it is natural to inquire, what were the causes which tended to reduce the Commonwealth from a state of happiness and prosperity to the deplorable situation in which we now behold it placed? In this inquiry, the first question which will naturally occur must be, what is the situation of our national credit? And what are the dispositions of our fellow citizens with respect to the fulfillment of these engagements, which in times of difficulty and danger, in times when the souls of men were tried, they were under a necessity of contracting?" He ultimately sums up of the importance of honoring those domestic and international agreements and the core principles of integrity. "Rome, the imperial mistress of the world, exhibits to our view the most illustrious example of the grandeur to which a nation may arrive by a sacred regard to public faith. It was not by the pageantry of her triumphs that she extended her dominion over the submissive world, but it was by her inseparable attachment to the laws of justice and equity and her punctilious observations of all the contracts in which she engaged." And finally, "In this country I am persuaded that there yet exists a spark of patriotism which may still rekindle a vivid flame. Above all, may your ruling passions ever be to preserve pure and immaculate the reputation of your country. May an inseparable attachment to this ever shine forth in your actions, ever be the favorite theme of your discourse, for it may safely be asserted that all the distresses in which the Commonwealth is involved are immediately connected with the loss of our national credit, and that of the invincible resolution to abide by all the agreements to which we have consented were displayed in the conduct of our citizens in general. We should soon rise superior to every temporary evil. Gentle peace and smiling plenty would again appear and scatter their invaluable blessings around the happy land. The hands of commerce would recover strength and spread the swelling sails. Arts and manufactures would flourish here and soon would vie with those of Europe. and science here would enrich the world with noble and useful discoveries. May national honor and integrity distinguish the American Commonwealth, till the last trump shall announce the dissolution of the world, and the whole frame of nature shall be consumed in one universal conflagration. Not bad for a newly minted college graduate, though at the age of 55, John Quincy would read a copy of his first prominent speech and remark in his journal, "The delivery of that oration was one of the most memorable events of my life. The incidents attending it were of a nature to make and leave a deep impression upon my mind. The appointment to deliver it was itself a high distinction, yet it was but the second honor of the class, and he who took the first, the preferred rival, sunk at the age of 35, to be forgotten. I reperuse this production now with humiliation to think how proud of it I was then, and how much I must blush for it now." In the immediate aftermath, however, the General Assembly was impressed, and he writes, "I found our chambers as full of company as they could hold, and was complimented and flattered on every side. One such day every year would ruin me. However, I still think that all the advantages of public commencement proceed from a gratification of vanity, and if this passion is fostered in 2 or 3 persons, it must be mortified in many others, and may therefore very probably do more harm than good." But his education was not quite complete. As his father before him had done, he was expected to study law, and so of course he did, for 3 years under future Massachusetts Supreme Court Chief Justice Theophilus Parsons. And now, finally, here he was, a young man whose parents had painstakingly pumped him full of all the knowledge and wisdom they possessed, as well as provided him with every opportunity to put him on the path to greatness, and then threw in an incredible amount of pressure to ensure he knew to his core that anything less than becoming one of the most preeminent men of his age would shame himself and them, giving all he'd been blessed with up to this point. If you're now thinking most would have broken under such expectations, well, his brothers and some others in his family lineage ultimately would crack under the pressure. But John Quincy, as we'll get into in the next video in the series, he merely bent considerably for a time, including falling into deep bouts of depression mixed with a whole lot of anxiety and self-doubt. But rather than turn to drink, as others in his family would do, John Quincy Adams coped in the most John Quincy Adams way in doing things like, about a year after graduating Harvard, giving an oration in front of some of the most distinguished individuals in Massachusetts, including Governor John Hancock at the Phi Beta Kappa Society at Harvard. This time, his speech was very aptly titled, "A Youth About to Enter the Scenes of Active Life." To give a small taste of the speech and his state of mind about such a youth in that position, he states, "The path of life becomes rugged with thorns. 1,000 obstacles apparently stand before us, and the approach to the seats of happiness, like that to the Garden of the Hesperides, seems under the perpetual custody of fiery dragons. We dwell with involuntary terror upon the ideas of malice, the treachery and envy which we expect from our fellow mortals, until we are ready to imagine that our life is to be a state of continual warfare with the whole human race. The baseless fabric of our hopes vanishes like the phantom of a fairy tale, and the mind, oppressed by the contemplation of these gloomy objects, is almost ready to settle in a state of sullen despondency." His Aunt Elizabeth Shaw, who John Quincy would live with for a little while during one of his deepest bouts with depression shortly after graduating Harvard, would write of this period of her nephew's life, "Perhaps no one knew better than myself the strong emotions which tore and agitated your mind. I could have sat by your side and counted out tear for tear. I longed to lighten your heart and to have you pour out all your grief into my feeling, faithful bosom." But, education now complete, the bent but not broken young man struggled on, desperately trying to find a way to fulfill the extreme expectations put upon him, but very explicitly with almost no idea how to do it or seemingly any hope for success without trying to cash in on his father's name, something he vehemently refused to do. If he was to become one of the great men of his era, it had to be exclusively by his own merits or not at all. Stay tuned for the next video in this The Secretary series, in which after a few years of struggle, John Quincy almost accidentally finds a way and takes his first true step onto a path that would ultimately change history.